And I will, okay. We'll wait. Welcome, come on in. Welcome to our career fair. We'll just start in a minute, wait for people to come in. We'll start in just a minute. Okay. I expect more people will be coming in, but we might as well begin this evening. Thank you all for attending Rare New England's Genetics Career Fair. Rare New England is a regional nonprofit that brings together patients, families, and providers, all who are touched by rare and complex diseases. It offers community educational opportunities, creates awareness of available resources, and builds foundations of support to improve patient quality of life. Regarding tonight's, it also provides educational opportunities for healthcare providers. Regarding tonight's program, I'd like to thank the following sponsors for their generous support: the New England Regional Genetics Network, Homology Medicines, Ionis Pharmaceuticals, Ultragenic Pharmaceutical, and Vertex Pharmaceuticals. So my name is Mark Horson. My specialty is pediatrics with a focus of genetics as a subspecialty, specifically in the area of biochemical or metabolic genetics. So if you think back on your biochemistry, I deal with patients and families who have defects in those biochemical pathways. Now, yeah, biochemistry can be abstract and rather dry, but it is that patient contact that really puts the human back in biochemistry and shows how relevant the urea cycle or the electron transport chain really is. So why are we doing this program tonight? Well, genetics impacts almost every area of medicine. So as you can imagine, there is a growing need for geneticists in this country and abroad. Patients and families want and need to hear information about the diseases they have, information to plan their futures, information as a couple with a family history looking to have children, and information about effective therapies now available for genetic disorders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So considering that there are more than 7,000 rare diseases, not all genetic, and growing, that's a lot of information that needs to be shared. But the impact of genetics is not just in rare disease. Genetics impacts how we manifest lots of mainstream diseases, including COVID-19, how we respond to disease, how we utilize medications, what medications are available or that are effective or safe, and so on. So this evening, you will hear from three physicians who specialize in the area of genetics: a general clinical geneticist who also does metabolic genetics and genetic research, a specialist who treats patients with genetic metabolic diseases, and a geneticist who works in the laboratory. You'll hear a bit about what they're doing, how their genetics expertise has helped to treat their patients and families, and or how the experience has impacted their own lives. A Q&A session will follow the three presentations. Please submit your questions as we go in the Q&A area, not the chat area, but the Q&A. And after that, I will guide you through additional opportunities to learn more about genetics. But first, you might think that liking biochemistry makes me a nerd, and the fact that I bring some biochemistry into the clinic makes me even more of a nerd. Well, fun fact, I am a nerd, but we genetics nerds can have fun too. So let me show you how with this very interesting genetic phenotype. Can you see that? That work? Okay,
Yes.
so here we go. Many, many years ago, when I was 23, I was married to a widow who was pretty as can be. This widow had a grown-up daughter who had hair of red. My father fell in love with her, and soon they two were wed. This made my dad my son-in-law and really changed my life. Now my daughter was my mother because she was my father's wife. To complicate the matter, even though it brought me joy, I soon became the father of a bouncing baby boy. My little baby then became a brother-in-law to dad, and so became my uncle, though it made me very sad. For if he was my uncle, then that also made him brother of the widow's grown-up daughter, who of course was my stepmother. Father's wife then had a son who kept him on the run, and he became my grandchild, for he was my daughter's son. My wife is now my mother's mother, and it makes me blue, because although she is my wife, she's my grandmother too. Now, if my wife is my grandmother, then I'm her grandchild, and every time I think of it, it nearly drives me wild. Because now I have become the strangest case you ever saw. As husband of my grandmother, I am my own grandpa. Oh, I'm my own grandpa. I'm my own grandpa. It sounds funny, I know, but it really is so. I'm my own grandpa. All right, so there you go, a lighter side of genetics. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first, speaker, Dr. David Sweetser. Since 2003, Dr. Sweetser has been at Massachusetts General Hospital and sees patients in genetics and metabolism, as well as pediatric hematology and oncology. He specializes in children and adults with metabolic disease, neurodevelopmental disorders, complex undiagnosed disorders, inherited hematologic disorders, and children with genetic disorders predisposing to malignancies. In 2011, he was appointed as Chief of Medical Genetics and Metabolism at MGH, and 6 years later was awarded the Holmes Endowed Chair in Genetics and Teratology. Under his leadership, he has helped grow specialty clinics at MGH for diseases such as Turner syndrome, Williams syndrome, and Klinefelter syndrome. He is also the MGH site director for the NIH-sponsored Undiagnosed Diseases Network. He teaches a graduate course, Genetics in Medicine, and is site director of the Harvard Medical School Genetics Training Program. Finally, he also runs a research lab in the Center for Genomic Medicine and MGH Cancer Center, investigating several genetic disorders, including Pitt-Hopkins syndrome and leukemia. He has systematically generated and characterized patient-derived cell models for several inherited causes of intellectual disability and neurodevelopmental disorders, developing assays amenable to drug screening and precision target therapeutics. For more information about Dr. Sweetser, please see his bio on the RNA website. David, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks, Mark, for that introduction and the opportunity to tell a little bit about myself. And I guess that was the goal, and also how I got here. And going through medical school, I wasn't actually certain about what I wanted to do, but I kind of settled on two different areas that were competing with each other. One was the field of medical genetics, and the other was hematology and oncology. And I was really most interested in kind of what sort of were some of the fundamental processes that were underlying growth and differentiation, and could have really gone in either direction. And my first sway was actually into genetics, and it was swayed by having a phenomenal instructor who was the head of genetics, where I was training at that time at Washington University in St. Louis. And that is the direction I initially had. And that was kind of a fun time as a fellowship, going around looking at all kinds of different genetic disorders. It was really a place that kind of brought to life a lot of what I had studied in medical school, and also gave me an introduction to metabolism. And I wouldn't say that we're all nerds, but it really brought to life the aspect of biochemistry. And it is hard to kind of get into all of those different biochemical pathways, but once you start realizing that there's patients who have defects or deficiencies in each one of those enzymes, and learning how they manifest, it really kind of brings it to life. And then it was kind of a bit of a circuitous route. I did take a detour into cancer genetics. And as I was kind of doing a postdoc and studying some of the fundamental processes of growth and development, it kind of led me in that direction, and started developing a program in leukemia, and then came around about back into genetics. And that's where I spend most of my time right now. And, you know, to go back, what really kind of fascinated me is you start learning about development. It's hard not to be in awe about how many things have to go right in order for a human being to form. And at the same time, it's kind of robust as you learn about it, how many of the fundamental developmental processes are. But then it's quite obvious that there's a tremendous diversity in the outcome of all of us, you know, subtle and not so subtle imperfections, and some that have quite tremendous consequences. And so that's really kind of where I decided I wanted to be, to try to help understand these developmental processes, and the consequences when they go awry, and what we can do to help the individuals who are affected. And yeah, so this is really a very stimulating position. This is pretty rare when I have a day that doesn't require me to hit the books and learn a little bit more about the patients that I'm seeing. So every day is really kind of a constant, you know, challenging to the brain in terms of learning. And I think in many ways I've got the dream job. I feel like I'm making a huge difference in many people's lives. Also having a chance to actually carry some of this into the lab, and make some progress in terms of understanding. So I kind of work in 3 different areas, as Mark had said, both in terms of diagnosis, research, and treatment. And diagnosis, that has become really quite rewarding, especially in the last handful of years with all of the advances that we've made in genomic medicine. It now is quite commonplace that we sequence somebody's entire genome, 23,000 genes. And that is a relatively new development since I've been on the scene. And quite literally, there's many patients that we've been able to solve that have eluded diagnoses. So it's not uncommon when we'll see a patient who's 20 years old who had gone through a diagnostic odyssey and gone through 5 generations of geneticists and have done hundreds of different studies, and we now have the tools to actually kind of cut to the chase and actually figure out what underlines their abnormality, and give them now something that they can wrap around. And this has really been a joint effort with the families. You become quite attached to many of these with some of these rare diseases, and it's not uncommon that some are so rare that there's not much that's written about them, but by teaming with the families and their connections through Facebook pages, that you really can kind of open up the knowledge to some of these disorders. And so there's quite a number of cases where I've done that. And at the same time, there still are a lot of limitations, even though these genetic tests are very powerful. They're complicated, and it's not so easy to interpret what the results are. And it does require a bit of training and knowledge about what the limitations are in interpreting the results, and in the range of tests that are available. So that's a large part of what we do, is to trying to educate the other physicians in terms of how to utilize genetic testing. And when you do a genetic test like that, you get kind of 2 answers. Either you get the answer you're looking for, or a negative answer, or you get something in between, something that looks really interesting. It might be significant, but we're not quite sure what it means. And so I spend a lot of my time in that space, trying to figure out if that's really the answer, or if it's not the answer, where the answer lies. And so I have been fortunate enough to be part of the Undiagnosed Disease Network. And this is a place that where you can refer patients that have already gone through the standard genetics diagnostic pathways and not come up with an answer, including after whole exome sequencing. And we've had the power and the resources to bring in a lot of the new technologies, including RNA-seq and metabolomic studies, and actually be able to take some of the variations that we see. We're still trying to sort out what the normal human variation is in the population and what really makes a disorder. But if you do some filtering and come up with a potential candidate, you can actually take it into the lab and figure out whether that might be the answer. And with the resources and all the networking that we have across the country, we've actually been able to discover dozens of new diseases. And so that's really rewarding. But there's still a lot of limitations in genetics, and it's an area that there's still so much to be understood. And even when you know you've got a patient that has something that has a genetic basis, it's pretty obvious. You see two family members born different times, they've got the same rare constellation of features. More often than not, we can't figure it out exactly what they have, even with the latest diagnostic techniques. So it is a lot of detective work that we do every day, but there also is a treatment aspect to it. As Mark had said, I do take care of metabolic disorders, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from Dr. Arnold. But this is a case where often an enzyme is missing, and with proper proper diet, nutrition, many of these can be managed and have a very good outcome. But there are also a lot of treatments that you could do with genetic disorders, and treatment sort of happens at different levels. Sometimes it's just a matter of coordinating the complex care about the various abnormalities, the various organ systems or various manifestations, and making sure that all of that care is kind of coordinated in a fashion that helps them to develop to the best of their potential. And along the way, you still collect a lot of patients where there's definitely something wrong, but we're just not smart enough to figure it out. And Dr. Corson knows this quite well from his practice, but there's a lot of patients that just need some help and need some validation that there is something, that there is something to their story, that they need some accommodations in the school, and need some relatively simple kind of supportive care that can go a long ways in terms of optimizing their development. So, it is really quite rewarding in many aspects. I've got a position here where it is see a whole variety of different patients. The field of genetics, as Mark had said, touches upon many different, basically every area of medicine. And so it really is an area that you need to be a broad medicalist in a sense. You need to know a lot about every different organ. Need to know about taking care of acute care medicines who are in the intensive care unit, as well as patients who just may have something much more subtle that's going on with them. But every organ system of your body that you can choose, whether it's the eyes or the hearing, not to mention the brain, or the heart, the pancreas, the kidney. They're all there's many different genetic disorders that could affect their function. And a lot of what we do is sort of helping the medical specialists in terms of figuring out if it is a genetic condition, and what that means and how that might implicate their therapy. So that's kind of a pretty broad overview about what I do, but it is, I hope I can kind of convey to you that it is a really exciting area to be into, and a chance to really interact with many brilliant people across the country, and tap into the brains of everybody that's sort of helping us make progress in this field.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for sharing that. folks, if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A and we'll take them at the end. Let's go on to our next speaker, Dr. Georgianne Arnold, from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Arnold graduated from Indiana University and received a master's in medical genetics from Indiana University, Purdue at Indianapolis. She received her MD from Upstate Medical University and completed residency in pediatrics at Northwestern and a fellowship in clinical genetics and clinical biochemical genetics at the University of Colorado. She's been a clinical and biochemical geneticist for 30 years. She is currently the clinical research director for pediatric genetics and genomics at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Her interests are in clinical outcomes research and development of clinical practice protocols. Also, Dr. Arnold recently completed 2 years as president of the Society for Inherited Metabolic Disorders, the professional society for biochemical genetics in this country. For more information about Dr. Arnold, please see her bio on the RNE website. Georgianne, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm surprised I could stick up my head in the door. So I came to genetics, I came to clinical biochemical genetics kind of through the back door. I had always been interested in genetics right from the time I learned about Gregor Mendel in high school biology. And I actually selected Indiana University out of Lovejoy's college catalog because I thought they had a major in genetics, which of course they didn't after I got there. But I went from there into graduate school in a PhD program. And the particular medical genetics PhD program at Indiana required the students to go to clinic and to go on into the Children's Hospital on consults and see patients so that you could see the clinical applications of what you're doing in the lab. And it turned out that the graduate students hated the clinic and they wanted to work in their lab. But I loved it when they forced me to go to clinic. And I didn't so much love it when they let me work in my lab. And so I realized that I was in the wrong aspect of genetics. So that required a change of education and a trip to medical school, where then I did pediatric residency and genetics. Then the mentors in graduate school that I attached to were what we call dysmorphologists, meaning they study birth defects and abnormal morphology. And so I thought that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to emulate those mentors. But when I got into fellowship, I happened to do my fellowship in a program that was very strong in biochemical genetics. Now, I had always liked biochemical genetics. I had really liked my cell biology course as an undergrad. I really liked the biochem class I took in graduate school. And in fact, they let me tutor it in medical school instead of taking it because I already had a couple of classes in it. And I loved it, but it never occurred to me that could be my life. But I got totally bit by the bug in my fellowship of how fascinating biochemical genetics is. So to people who are just starting in biochemistry, it can look really intimidating. It's just this bunch of pathways and you have to memorize them and they don't make any sense. And why do they do what they do? But the truth of the matter is, if you strip biochemical reactions down to their pathways, they all make perfect sense. They all explain exactly what they do. The name of the enzyme pretty much tells you exactly what it does. And these diseases actually affect humans. And they affect humans in a straightforward way, like if you lack an enzyme in the urea cycle, you'll get hyperammonemia. And that can cause coma and brain damage and death. But it also works in secondary ways, such as there's an inside pathway in the urea cycle that makes nitric oxide. Nitric oxide makes blood vessels dilate. And now they're starting to give some stroke patients arginine, which is the intermediate in the urea cycle that makes the nitric oxide. So it turns out we're treating strokes with the urea cycle. Actually, there's somebody who's experimenting on treating erectile dysfunction with arginine with the urea cycle. A friend of mine who is a metabolic geneticist, whose best buddy is an adult ICU doc, kind of started to look at adults who got pulmonary hypertension after cardiac surgery and said, and it turns out that some of them are carriers of urea cycle disorders or are mildly affected urea cycle disorders, and they don't make enough nitric oxide when you stress them with cardiac surgery. So the biochemistry is kind of everywhere. And if you really delve into it, it's not intimidating at all, and it's kind of fun. So med school, pediatric residency, genetics fellowship, and metabolic fellowship. Now they actually allow you to combine a genetics residency and fellowship with a regular residency, mostly pediatrics. There's some internal medicine, there's some OBGYN. So there's more than one way to get into clinical genetics. And so for years, what I did was to treat children with inborn errors of metabolism and also still see children with general genetics disorders. Today, I saw a child with a cleft palate. I saw a child who had a chromosome abnormality on deletion on chromosome 5 that gives the babies a cry that sounds like a cat. So it's called Cri-du-chat syndrome. I saw a child with maple syrup urine disease, which is a disease in the metabolism of valine, leucine, and isoleucine that causes you to excrete something that smells like maple syrup. I saw somebody with a carnitine defect. That carnitine is it's kind of like a vitamin that your body makes that helps you get fat into the mitochondria to burn for energy. Gosh, what else did I see today? So, you know, it was a busy day and I saw a lot of cool things, but also I had been there when a child with a particularly critical a metabolic disease in the breakdown of protein was born. She'd had a liver transplant. The disease was called methylmalonic acidemia, but she's home sick. And when I returned the page, the dad said to me, "Oh, I'm so glad it's you." Because he said, "You were so good to us when she was diagnosed and you helped us so much and we just really trust you." And that makes you feel really good. At one point, a couple of years ago, I was just having a terrible day. My NIH grant tanked. I was not happy. And when I walked to the cafeteria for lunch, I met the mothers of 2 of my patients that I had not seen in several years. They'd gotten transplanted and gone off to other services. And both of those mothers thanked me for saving their child's life. And boy, I'll tell you, it made my day a whole lot better. So there is more than one way to get into genetics. You can get in as a PhD. You can get in as an MD. And then you can, you can do it. Most people who do both do an MD PhD program where you do them both at the same time. Unlike me, who did it the slow way. Doing the graduate school first and then the medical school. But it's really very interesting. Now, the second stage of my career was research. And when I first started in the PhD program in research, I kind of wondered how I would ever have any ideas. What would I study? Then you start to see patients and you start to ask questions like, why does it seem like my PKU patients are a little bit anemic? What is going on with that? And I was able to do a chart review of the CBCs on all of my patients with phenylketonuria. And it turned out that they have fewer red cells that contain a little more hemoglobin. So on a culture counter, which is the way they count blood cells in the lab, they looked a little anemic. But they were actually slightly downshifted in their total hematocrits. And I expected it to be tied to their iron levels, which we also follow in these patients because they don't eat meat. So they don't eat high iron containing food. But it turned out it was actually more tied to their protein intake. So I was able to compare their protein status. So I was able to compare their protein nutrition with their iron nutrition, with their CBCs, and come with an answer. And you don't have to worry about wondering whether you'll have questions to ask. Once you start, you'll have more questions than you have time or money to answer. So, okay, have I talked long enough?
Thank you, Georgianne. Great.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing. All right, our last speaker, Dr. Lisa Braley. She obtained her undergraduate degree in biology from Harvard University and her medical degree from University of Connecticut. She completed residency and fellowship training in genetics at Yale University and is board certified in clinical genetics, cytogenetics, and molecular genetics. She's she served as Associate Director of Cytogenetics at Ameripath Northeast, Quest Diagnostics, and as Technical Director of Molecular Diagnostics and Clinical Trials at Dianon Systems, both in Shelton, Connecticut. And she has been adjunct faculty in the past at the University of Connecticut and the University of New Haven. Her interests include DNA sequencing, data analysis, genetics education outreach, and metabolic disease. She and her husband, Bob, reside in Derby, Connecticut, where she enjoys hiking, swimming, playing the violin, reading, and promoting community engagement. For more information about Dr. Braley, please see her bio on the RNE website. Lisa, thank you for joining us. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I guess I need to update myself.
Yes.
So for just the last few months since November, I am an assistant professor in the Department of Pathology at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. And I'm the associate director of the Tumor Cytogenomics Lab. So I have ended up living completely in the laboratory world. So I'm kind of the opposite of Dr. Arnold in that I went to medical school. I also went to medical school late, but I got there and then really wasn't sure if I'd made the right decision. I didn't like being on call. I wasn't fully comfortable with my feeling like my skills were right for medicine. But sleep deprivation was a huge problem for me. So I was really feeling like, what have I done? What have I done? So in addition to my genetics training, I kind of jumped around exploring. I did 2 years of pathology training. I did 1 year of pediatrics. Those were at the University of North Carolina. I also did 2 years of clinical genetics, 2 years of molecular genetics, and a year of cytogenetics. And the interesting thing is that I felt kind of like I was at some level flailing around, but also maybe building a patchwork quilt of myself. And that background has been interestingly helpful. So I have ended up as an MD who doesn't see patients. I've maintained my medical licenses, and I haven't needed them because the jobs that I've done are often done by PhDs. So I am board certified through the American Board of Medical Genetics in molecular and cytogenetics at this point, also clinical genetics, but I don't use that. Now, as as a laboratory geneticist in a cancer lab, so remember I'm doing tumor cytogenomics. We look at chromosomes, just classical cytogenetics. We do microarray, a more recent technique to look at gains and losses in the genome. And we also do fluorescence in situ hybridization, and we are hoping to be bringing up next generation sequencing as a way to do more detailed chromosome analysis. So I'm in a place where I'm the technologies are still very much changing that whole business of there's always something new. There's a new way to examine the genome and to apply that to older technology. Cytogenetics is sort of the basis of genetics in many ways. So back in the 50s, when they figured out how many chromosomes there were, it was fairly simple, like basically counting them. And since then, we've gone from counting chromosomes to analyzing chromosomes at the level of sequencing. So I find that being an MD in the laboratory has worked out to be a place that I feel pretty comfortable and where I really feel like I can contribute. People who are purely PhDs entering into a laboratory science, delivering clinical results, sometimes don't have a perspective on the patients in the same way. So I love really looking at a clinical history in the context of my laboratory results. When this doesn't make sense, what does this patient actually have, going into the medical record and putting that together? So I find it's very helpful to bring my MD training into laboratories that often don't have MDs working in them. I am thrilled with my new job. I've spent much of the last 14 years since I completed my training. I had been, as Mark introduced me, at commercial laboratories, and those were okay. Didn't totally feel like they were my intellectual home. Commercial labs are a fine place to be. They're turning out results. They're actually often doing it quite quickly. But they are doing that testing to turn it over quickly, get results out there, bring the money in. It's commercial. What I'm really enjoying at Mount Sinai is that I have a very predictable day. I basically have the same schedule every day, Monday through Friday. I'm not on call. I go in and I have adventures in testing every day. I'm attending tumor board, communicating results to clinicians, very much part of an intellectual family in the process of understanding the myriad different kinds of cancers. I've probably learned more in the last 5 months than I learned in the previous 14 years of work. So I would point out that not everybody who goes to medical school actually winds up wanting to be at the bedside, and that's okay. I have forged a career not as somebody seeing patients, but it's also an interesting choice to make to be somebody who has a lab, whether it's a research lab or diagnostic lab, that can complement a clinical career. It can be something that gives you more flexibility, makes you a more attractive employee, is just a very exciting way to combine information. So I would, from my point of view, I certainly advocate for my lack of call, very predictable schedule, and sort of a flexibility, an additional flexibility that's not tied to a clinic schedule. But I would also point out that laboratory medicine is very complementary. Laboratory genetics is very complementary to a clinical career, whether that's a biochemical lab, as a biochemical geneticist, a genetics lab for somebody within pathology or within hematology. The knowledge that you gain in diagnostics can also very much be applied to a research career. And I would explain at this point that the laboratory training that I have is sponsored by the American Board of Medical Genetics and Genomics. When I did it, it was a molecular fellowship and separately a cytogenetics fellowship. At this point, and that took me 3 years. It was 2 years and 1 year. Each one individually would have been 2 years, but and now they have what's called laboratory genetics and genomics. So the training through the American Board of Medical Genetics in laboratory genetics is now one thing that they call LGG, laboratory genetics and genomics. And that there are many programs. I don't think they're all filling at this point in time. So it's definitely definitely a training that is available and is, sorry, when Mark comes on, I know it's time to end. So laboratory genetics and genomics is the training process that gets you to my kind of laboratory career. And I'm open for any questions from anybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate that. All right, so panelists, can you turn on your cameras and we'll start some questions. David, this comment, thank you, Dr. Sweetser. Genetics seems to grow much faster as a field compared to other medical fields. How do you personally stay up to date with developments? How often do you collaborate with colleagues on cases? You are muted. You want to turn on your mic.
Yep, thanks. You know, this is something you realize quite early on, that you just can't stay up on all the advances that are made in genetics. And to be honest, I don't have much time to sit down and read a lot of the journals. I sort of skim through those and grab the ones that really kind of strike my eye. A lot of it is kind of on the job learning, as I said. You see a patient and you often have to hit the literature, and you can go to some good review sites, but often you have to go to PubMed and seek out the latest case reports and learn more. And we do rely a lot on our colleagues. I think that is one thing all of us would kind of agree to. There's a pretty robust network, you know, around the country and even international in terms of collegiality, in terms of helping people with patients. And so I quite often will seek the advice of another, you know, author of a publication that's come out. There are bulletin boards we have. So if we find a rare genetic condition, or we think we found one where there's a gene that looks like it's a candidate gene, we can post it on what's called a bulletin board, Matchmaker Exchange. And we all kind of go to that and connect with other researchers. And so we do this all the time, been part of case series for new diseases. When we do think we found a variant and want some help, we'll often look into the research realm. So it's not uncommon that we'll find a researcher, you know, in Germany or England that's been studying a gene their entire life in the lab, not quite realizing that there was a patient that they could attach to their disorder. So we've done that, you know, half a dozen times, where we reached out to somebody and said, you know, we found a variant in this gene. We think, you know, what you've been studying all your life in the lab really has some clinical significance, and would you kind of help us determine whether this variant has some abnormalities in your biochemical assays? And you know, we've collaborated with people in, like I said, countries around the world, Japan, and elsewhere. So it is an active area where we're sort of reaching out to colleagues for collaborations.
Thank you. Georgianne, you talked about a lot of diseases. Are there human trials or treatments for the genetic disorders you mentioned?
Yes, as a matter of fact, at Pittsburgh, we are a major clinical trial center for a number of treatment disorder treatments, including gene therapy. So gene therapy, other medication therapies, yes. And that's one of the more fun things that I do. Although gene therapy trials still kind of scare the hell out of me, but you know.
Why is that?
In gosh, what, around the year 2000, a patient with a urea cycle defect died from his gene therapy. There have been a couple of kids with non-metabolic diseases, with neurologic diseases, who have died from gene therapy, from probably all reactions to the vectors by which you deliver the gene into the patient. So we're pretty careful about it.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, I think it was even before 2000. It really put a hold on the gene therapy development for probably almost 10 years, I think. Dr. Braley, Lisa, you've seen a lot of technologies coming. Give an example of a next technology that might be coming into the laboratory. Is there anything coming down the pike? Oh, please turn on your mic.
I don't know if it's going to be the next big thing, but optical genome mapping is one that's pretty interesting. That's another way to map what's going on along the length of a chromosome, so that you can actually see what genes are translocated next to other genes. What you can sort of read through segments without actually doing full sequencing. And also the use of next generation sequencing, not just to sequence the genome, but to sequence through chromosome translocations that are common in cancer. So I'll be very, very interested to see next generation sequencing in the cytogenetics laboratory, because that's still really a crossover between molecular and cytogenetics that should be pretty fun to look at, and could also serve some purposes for constitutional disorders. But I think it's more of a cancer thing, because there's a lot more rearrangement of the genome in cancer.
Thank you. Folks in the audience, again, don't hesitate to write your questions in the Q&A section. We have some questions that actually came to us before tonight's fair.
There's two in there now.
I'm sorry, what?
There's two in there now.
Yes, and
Okay.
I'm getting to them.
Okay.
So Georgianne, thank you, Dr. Arnold. It seems you and I discovered very early on in our careers our passions. Were there points in your time in medical school that made you question your interest in genetics or pediatrics?
No, never. I went into medical school knowing that I was going to be a geneticist. I thought I was going to be a dysmorphologist. I never dreamed I would be a biochemical geneticist, but I always knew that's what I was going to do. And it made med school easier, because having been in grad school, I had broken out of that, memorize things for the test, and more into how do you think through things. And I think that was a definite advantage.
Right. And there are actually, and some medical schools or medical students sometimes segregate into different medical schools. If you go to, say, Harvard Medical School, many of the students there sort of have an idea exactly where they want to go. And, they know exactly where they're going, and they know what laboratories they want to focus on. And people who go to other medical schools, often it's much more general, and you get a sort of a broader view. So that also plays a role as well. David, what are some common diagnoses when working in medical genetics? Like some of the common ones that you see?
Well, we see Yeah, I guess as classes of disorders, we often look at autism, for instance. So that's an interesting disorder. That's a common one that gets referred to us. And we kind of have a standard pathway that we that we work through. There's sort of two tests, Fragile X and a chromosomal microarray, for instance, that is probably the largest yield. Fragile X is one of the most common intellectual disorders in males that we see. And then these chromosomal microarrays will pick up copy number variants where there's a small region of the chromosome that's missing or absence. And there are quite literally thousands of different areas that can be missing, and it just depends on the genes that are there that can be involved. But turns out that many of those have manifestations and developmental delays in autism. And so as a class, that's probably a large portion of what we see. Yeah, and I guess I can say, other diagnoses that a common diagnosis that we get is just intellectual disability. And it's hard to kind of pick out a common one. There really are hundreds of different disorders that we do see that can be diagnosed. There's a few specialty ones, like you had mentioned Pitt-Hopkins. So a lot of us may specialize in a rare genetic syndrome and have a chance to connect with lots of families and bring them together and become one of the world's experts, again, kind of with the help of the families of pairing together. So Pitt-Hopkins is sort of one that I see have a specialty clinic, and people get referred from around the world, and they have a number of medical problems that we can help them with, as well as carrying their biological samples into the lab to do research studies. It is quite varied.
Good, terrific. So, question for all of you. Thank you, doctors, for your insights. How is your work-life balance? Georgianne, do you want to start? We're going to go through everybody. Georgianne, comment?
We went through a period, I would say 10 years ago, when the med centers were pushing and pushing and pushing us to the point where we had no work-life balance. They have finally realized that they are wearing the doctors down, and things are improving. They've substantially cut back on the number of patients that are required to see now in Pitt. Also, as you get older, you just, I didn't think I could take time off when I was young. And now I realize if I need time off, I just take it. So yeah, and also the research career that I'm into now is much less physically taxing. So you change over time in what you do. You can run around the wards a lot better when you're 35 and 40 than you can when you're 65. So you start looking for other ways. And for me, it's been clinical research.
So Lisa, you talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but can you address the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did pretty much address it. I find that the kinds of laboratories that I've worked in have allowed me to have a predictable, normal day. My biggest issue right now is that I'm actually commuting a pretty long ways because I'm actually pretty excited about the position that I'm in. So my commute is more my problem than my job. I sleep on the train to New York City and use that as part of my nighttime sleep.
And David, you work.
But I would say that the laboratory has certainly allowed me to have flexibility, and I'm hoping to get more involved in research at the research institution that I'm at. One last thing I wanted to say, just sort of connecting to Georgianne's passion for biochemical pathways and all of the disorders that David was just talking about, was that one of the things that I love in the cancer world is the connection between developmental pathways. So genes that are normal and allow us to grow in a normal way, and that they can go wrong and cause syndromes, whether that's just morphology or biochemical, developmental, cognitive, but that those same genes are the genes that go wrong in cancer. So a pathway that drives normal growth, and that can go wrong in a kid as they're developing, can go wrong and cause cancer. And that connection is just madly cool. Like something that could really like make me feel like Georgianne. Like I could sit here being the person who says, I want an easy life. I wasn't sure I like this. I want to sleep at night. But I'm also somebody who says like, wow, this stuff is so cool.
Yeah.
And so it's a pretty neat connection. So I have a good life.
Excellent. So David, you work at the flagship hospital of Harvard Medical School. So that's the big time. So tell us about your work-life balance.
Well, so I've raised a family, so I've got 3 kids. They're all grown up right now. I do have to say, back in those days, I did go through an MD PhD program, and that's when we had started to have kids, and then finishing up in medical school and going through residency. And I would say those having children really forces you to have a work-life balance. You've got to go do stuff that that disengage your mind, and kind of connect you with the world, in the outdoors. And all of my kids now are out of the house. The last one left last year, and I would say that it does kind of free you some time to kind of do what your passion is. I think all of us, kind of try to convey that we really enjoy what we're doing, and it's a lot of work, no doubt about it. A lot of work along the way, a lot of what you kind of feel is kind of delayed gratification, in some sense. But I think, every step along the way, I was doing something that I really did enjoy doing. So life-work balance is kind of relative to what you value most in life. I think I've been fortunate enough to have a wife that I guess you could say it's fortunate enough that she works hard also and has long hours. And so we can relate to each other. We both enjoy our work. We do try to make time, on the weekends when we can. I would say that it's not the optimal life-work balance. If I think about my health, there's especially as you start getting older and you're having more administrative responsibilities. I find myself trying to protect the life-work balance of the younger colleagues that I have kind of at my expense, if I would, because I can kind of give up a little bit more, and to me it kind of means a lot in my life to keep the work going and keep the patients going and making sure the ship is kind of running smoothly. So this is kind of my life. I do feel like I get burned out at times and really need a little bit of time to disengage. And when I do, I always feel guilty because there's so much work that needs to be done that I'm not doing.
Well, everyone should have a boss like you. But what I would say, it was a fair comment, is if you decide to go into medicine at all, you should decide on going into medicine only if you are prepared to guard your personal life. If you don't, medicine will consume you, no matter what area of medicine you will. Medicine will consume you. It's the nature of the field. And so you have to establish very early on boundaries or walls that protect your life, so that you don't get into the complications that can be associated with a medical career. So that's just a general comment. But
I have to say I wasn't that good at that when I was young. And part of it is there's this sort of heady, what's the word, enmeshment with this feeling of being indispensable. But eventually you realize you have to make yourself dispensable.
yeah. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is share my screen and just go over some other learning opportunities for you to discover more about the field of genetics. And this will be provided, you will send this out if you haven't gotten this already. But what we can do is help you with one-on-one conversations with a geneticist. And that could be any one of the categories. It would be one-on-one with the focus being on what you are thinking. What you should do, though, is let us know that you're interested and send us a letter of intent with a CV so that we can help whoever you're going to talk with know more about you. And we'll put you in touch with a geneticist. If you go to the American Society of Human Genetics website, you'll find Careers in Human Genetics, which is information about career options at all levels of the academic ladder, everywhere from undergrad to postdoctoral. There's also something, if you're already in the field, a career accelerator, so advice for career search interviews and so on. There is also the possibility of an on-site elective, an opportunity to shadow a geneticist as he or she sees patients. It's not that easy because one has to obtain security clearance, but it is an opportunity potentially of seeing patients and diseases and hearing about their concerning issues. Again, for this, we need a letter of intent and a CV or resume in advance. There are online electives, so online counterparts to the in-hospital shadowing experience. There are some on my website, VMP Genetics. We have an online metabolism elective of metabolic disorders associated with stroke and associated with encephalopathy, where we talk a little bit about the diseases and we hear from patients who speak for 5 or 10 minutes about their disorders. So again, contact us for details. The Rare Disease Day Speaker Series. So Rare New England hosts a speaker series through the Rare Disease Day season. Rare Disease Day is the last day of February. And so from January to March, we host presentations at a variety of medical venues across New England. And this was our speaker series for this year. We were present in all 6 New England states, covering a wide variety of disorders. You may notice that these have a metabolic orientation, but hey, I'm the one that's planning the series and I'm a metabolic geneticist, so I get to plan the series. So, but all these are disorders that are among the 7,000 rare diseases, and most of these have actually treatments. So recognizing them is important. The American College of Medical Genetics offers a summer scholars program for first-year medical students. The summer scholars have already been chosen for 2022, but keep this in mind. If you're in medical school during your first year, this is an opportunity for you. And finally, for first-year medical students, for all medical students, the Global Genes Rare Compassion Project is an opportunity to be linked with a patient or family with a rare disease to more fully understand their experience of living with a genetic disorder. So these will be sent out to you. You can keep this in mind if you want more information about a genetics career. So at this point, I want to thank all of you for attending tonight's session. I will ask Kevin to join us for just a final evaluation. Kevin, are you online with us? I don't see Kevin. Okay, so it's 7:34 Eastern Time. I want to thank all of you for participating tonight, speakers for sharing with us your experiences, and folks in the audience, I hope you learned something. Please reach out, ask questions. We really appreciate questions and sharing our experiences. So thank you all, and I wish you all a good night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay, are you still there, Mark? Nope. Where's my